And assure you that what you will observe is a vast wasteland.
Whatever it is, you try and channel it for good.
You'll see a procession of
deny what they think is false, argue what they think is false. You have to have free and uncorrupted communication.
We have with us tonight one of the pioneers in journalism who will interview this year's honorees. Widely acknowledged as the Dean of the White House Press Corps, Helen Thomas has been a trailblazer in one of the country, and she is one of the country's most accomplished journalists. She's known for her high integrity. She asks tough questions and tells the truth as she sees it. How wonderful. We just need to have a whole country full of journalists like you, Helen. Tonight, she's going to lead a three-way interview regarding some of the most pressing issues facing our country and the world. She's gone from copy girl to White House correspondent, where for 40 years she has covered every president since JFK. And when we asked her tonight who was the president that she most admired, it was her first one, JFK. She has set a high standard and broken down barriers for women in the press by becoming the first woman officer of the National Press Club after it agreed to admit women as members, and the first woman president of the White House Correspondents Association. As White House Bureau Chief for United Press International from 1974 to 2000, she was the first woman to have the privilege of asking the first question at presidential news conferences. She became the first woman reporter to close a presidential news conference in 1961 during John F. Kennedy's first term with the traditional, "Thank you, Mr. President." Helen has been a national syndicated columnist for Hearst newspapers since July 2000. She's a graduate of Wayne State University, and she's received 30 honorary doctorate degrees. That's impressive, Helen. She also has received a number of other awards, including the National Press Club's Fourth Estate Award, the Columbia University Journalism Award, the International Media Foundation Lifetime Achievement Award, the Society of Professional Journalists First Lifetime Award, and the Ellis Island American Legend Medal, and many, many others. We are pleased to have her with us tonight for this interview. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Helen Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It's always hard to hear your obituary. And as for thank you, Mr. President, I've always wanted to say no thank you, Mr. President. And as for the awards, you're only as good as your last story. That's our credo. Good evening. I'm profoundly honored to be here tonight among those who strive to give peace a chance. The Nuclear Age Peace Foundation has invited us to hear from two of the great men of our time who have done so much to make this a safer world. But are they voices crying in the wilderness? I hope not, but sometimes I admit I despair at the vast silence in this country. Still, we know that the only way for evil to prevail is for good people to do nothing. I recall the Martin Luther King March on Washington when he delivered his immortal speech, "I Have a Dream." But I remember even more on that program the cameo appearance by a rabbi who had been in a Hitler concentration camp, and he said that the greatest sin of all in the Nazi era was silence. So it makes me happy when I know there are still voices in this country from people who are not afraid to be heard. Their profiles in courage. I guess I don't have to describe myself as a relentless, outraged liberal. Born that way, will always stay that way. Who does not believe in wars of choice, preemptive, unprovoked war, which we are in today with no light at the end of the tunnel. Up to now, presidents I've covered made some gestures to put the genie back in the bottle. Treaties, open skies, non-proliferation, but not the present administration, which seems to think the unthinkable. Since we are the world's only superpower, are we in a position to dictate? It's been difficult to cover a president who announced that he wanted to be a war president. I've been on the Washington sidelines for many wars. I went to Washington near the end of World War II, the war that nearly everyone believed in. We had unity, common purpose. Then the Korean War, not as much support, perhaps, which has never been really settled, believe it or not. Vietnam, a debacle. Gulf War I, and now Iraq, in which every White House rationale for it has turned out to be untrue. No weapons of mass destruction, no ties to Al-Qaeda, no threats by a third world country against the world's only superpower. No apologies, no explanations. The last rationale, which I first heard in the White House press room shortly after the war started, when all other reasons had failed, well, they finally hit a rationale that could only be all-encompassing. We were told that the invasion occurred because Iraq was the central front in the war against terrorism. It wasn't then. It may have become that now. Oddly, the administration says Al-Qaeda declared Iraq the central front. But I assure you, the record will show. The president continues to make inflammatory statements about the war and how we'll have total victory. Reality is another thing. The word peace has never been spoken recently. It's not in the White House vocabulary. So now I think I should lighten up and tell you a couple of my favorite reminiscences. I remember my first days in Washington when I went knocking on the doors of the National Press Building with Liz Carpenter, who later became a great Texas newspaper woman and was Lady Bird Johnson's press secretary. Well, Liz was always on the plump side, and she ran out of money a couple of days before I did. And she wired her brother, "Please send me $200 or I'm going to have to sell my body." Her brother wired back, "Sell it by the pound." but he sent the money. Another fond memory was LBJ, who, like all the other presidents, had a stable of speechwriters. And Johnson once asked that a certain speech be prepared, and when the writer brought him the first draft, he looked at it and said, "Voltaire, Voltaire. People I'm going to talk to don't know who Voltaire is." He grabbed a pen, scratched out Voltaire, and scribbled in, "As my dear old daddy used to say." Well, I could go on and on about what we journalists fondly call our war stories about our beats, but I'm sure you would rather hear from these two wonderful, eminent guests and honorees. Most of the presidents I covered believed in peace. Certainly John F. Kennedy, who went to the brink with Nikita Khrushchev. Both had been in war and retreated to save humanity. Profiles in statesmanship. Would that we see that again. I've had the privilege of grilling presidents over the years, and I'm delighted now to question two leaders who have devoted a lifetime to taking a stand for peace. Dr. Daniel Ellsberg, and I'm proud to say he comes from my hometown, Detroit, and Senator Douglas Roche. We've allowed each of them only a couple of minutes to make opening remarks. So Dr. Ellsberg, would you please?
Well, my opening remark is my brother graduated from Wayne State University,
really?
so I used to. I think, and I was telling my relatives the other night that I had my first drink in the dormitory at Wayne State University, thanks to him, when I was 16.
You don't, right?
But well, opening remark. I was struck by the moderator here tonight, who said that this has been a bad week, whether you're in Washington, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. And I was thinking, did I miss something? I thought it was the start of something wonderful. As a matter of fact, I must say I'm finding it fun to read the newspaper every day for the first time, and I can't remember when. Since Watergate.
You can't tell what he is, can you?
Since Watergate, and I expect it to get better. We're having a little disagreement here beforehand. Helen feels that this may be the last indictment. I hope she's wrong. My gut tells me that it's not the last indictment, partly because I'm influenced by the fact that I lived through this process exactly 30 years ago. The White House plumbers then started with one indictment, but that was for exactly the same situation as the president here. Criminal acts by the White House to silence a whistleblower. In this case, Joe Wilson. In my case, they were trying to keep me from putting out information directly on Nixon that they feared I had, that went beyond the Pentagon Papers. They went into my former doctor's office to get information to blackmail me with, later brought people up to incapacitate me totally. And when these crimes came out, a whole slew of White House aides were indicted, went down, and Nixon was facing impeachment. I'll just say, I have a gut feeling right now, maybe because of this experience, that Cheney has a lot of reason to sweat right now from Fitzgerald. And I hope that no one will speak for me when the day that he's indicted and has to resign, it's called a bad week. That will not be a bad week. So I think we're heading into something very good here. But the urgency of it, the urgency of getting this team out, and for good or bad, Fitzgerald, I think, is our best hope at this moment for pulling apart this administration to a degree where we could get a Democratic House in 2006, where we could get investigations and impeachment, and a Democratic Senate where we could get conviction in impeachment. Now, I don't think that's very likely, but it's our best hope for getting this gang out. We should not be waiting, we can't wait 3 more years, we may have to, but we can't be content with that. And I think that it's worth our utmost efforts to change a small probability of that into a somewhat less small probability. And I'll just end on the subject of the evening here. I think that this administration wants to resume nuclear testing, as the Republican platform has said for years now, and in fact that they would not do it before another 9/11. And I think if another 9/11 happens, there's a number of things they will do, which we may get into later, and I think resumption of nuclear testing is one of them. And I'd love to hear Doug's view on that, but I'm sure we would agree on the catastrophic effects of that, if that did happen, on the arms race in general and the likelihood. My wife and I were talking today with the Kriegers on the fact that we are in a new phase now of danger which was not even foreseen, really. We weren't thinking about that 30 years ago. Our eyes were focused on the overall arms race between the US and Soviet Union. More recently, in the last 20 years, on proliferation. But now, the amount of nuclear material in the world, and I think Doug would agree on me on this, I think, and the ease of getting it somehow from Russia, poorly guarded stocks in Russia, or Pakistan, or North Korea, is such that the chance confronts us if it's getting into the hands of terrorists who cannot be deterred. So the thing that has kept people silent over the years with the arms race, the notion that the people at top must know what they're doing the best for us, and whatever happens, we can deter not only Russia, but China and India and Pakistan, or whoever might come along, the states that might get these weapons. We can deter them if we have more, bigger, more accurate warheads. Has no relevance whatever to the state that this policy has brought us to, and that is nuclear materials in the hands of Al-Qaeda. So I think we're facing an extremely urgent situation with leaders who could not be trusted less to deal with it wisely. In fact, I think it could be summed up that as disastrous as Bush's policy is for confronting terrorism by occupying Iraq, which has made the terrorist threat that you remarked in Iraq greater every week we were there, from zero, essentially from zero, now to a significant part of the terrorist network, as his policy on nuclear weapons, of making us safer on nuclear by threatening other nations with our own first use of nuclear weapons, giving them every incentive to acquire nuclear weapons to deter us, is as disastrous a policy. And it's therefore simply essential not only for this country but for the world to get these men out.
Senator, how about some opening remarks or a rebuttal or
Thank you, Helen. First, allow me to express my appreciation and thanks to David Krieger and the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation for this Lifetime Achievement Award, and thank you, Deandra, for your very kind comments. I must say, Deandra, I felt coming up here and taking this award from you, I felt a little fraudulent because there's a certain subtext in a Lifetime Achievement Award that maybe you're getting toward the end of here. And I want to say very emphatically that I'm going to retire the day that the last nuclear weapon is destroyed on the face of the earth. There is a lot of work to do. Before I say anything more, ladies and gentlemen, my dear friends, and I really feel wonderful coming to Santa Barbara again. I've been here before, and I want to present myself to you as a Canadian. And I do that for this reason. First of all, I love this country very much. I lived here for 8 years of my life during the Kennedy years. 3 of my children were born here. I traveled as a journalist through every single one of the 50 states. I know the United States. I know the American people. And I love this country. I go to the UN in New York. I mean, run business, but it's a joy to be in New York. And when I come to California, it's like being in heaven. So I want to put that out right now, my feeling for this country. Because if Helen provokes me enough tonight, I might make some comments about the policies of the government of the United States. I don't want to do it too soon because I'm a little bit reticent, to tell you the truth. It's one thing for Dan to make the comments. He's an American citizen, I'm not. But you know, when we talk about nuclear weapons, the whole world has a stake in this issue. And it is the United States that is driving the agenda. And we have now reached a point where the United States has changed so the rules of the game, so to speak. whereas nuclear weapons were held for deterrence purposes during the Cold War, they're now, under the Bush Doctrine, threatened to be used for warfighting strategies. The United States has really got to learn that they can't have a two-class world in which a certain number of states hold to themselves the right to maintain their nuclear weapons while proscribing their acquisition by any other state. And this is causing a reaction that we have seen in the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the review conference that I attended in May and the run-up conferences, and when we get going here, Helen, I might say a few more words about that. But finally, I do not want my comments tonight to be interpreted as somebody coming here and just criticizing, however merited some of the criticism might be. I want to spend as much of my time as I can tonight in a creative mode, because I do feel creative in this respect. I represent the Middle Powers Initiative, which has been referred to here tonight, which is a coalition of 8 non-governmental organizations specializing in nuclear disarmament, of which the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation is one. And our project, in the midst of all this gloom that we're experiencing as a result of the paralysis in nuclear weapons negotiations, we have started a project called the Article 6 Forum, which is bringing together, we held a meeting in October at the UN in New York, of 28 middle power countries that we invited to come. And I can tell you that these countries want to work together to plan the political, legal, and technical requirements for a nuclear weapons-free world. This is creative work that we are doing. Rather than cursing the darkness, lighting a candle. And I can tell you from my travels around the world that there are a lot of governments and a lot of publics who do want to move ahead on the nuclear disarmament agenda, and we have to help them. And I hope that the work that we do creatively will inspire and help people such as you're here tonight, and not just in this room alone. There's lots of rooms across this country where people feel as we do. And that will help to reinforce you to press your own government to accommodate its policies to the common good of the world community.
Thank you. Well, my first question for Dr. Ellsberg, actually for both of you. Why did the United States invade Iraq? And do you see any resemblance to the run-up of the Vietnam War?
It's a little hard. Doug has given me leave, I think, to criticize my own government here. Right?
And I want,
as an American citizen.
One ad thing, should we pull out?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned earlier, I think, that it was an unprovoked war, and I think I heard you say earlier, an aggressive war. Did I not? Did you use that word or not? I'll use it in any case.
Okay.
This is a war, I'd say, as clear-cut aggression as Saddam's attack into Kuwait, or as Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan, or to go earlier, and still in my lifetime, Hitler's invasion of Poland, or France or others, without a shred of legitimacy to it. The lack of UN authorization meant that our going ahead was a clear violation of the UN Charter, which is the supreme law of the land in this country, along with the Constitution having been ratified by our Senate. And simply a throwing over of any constraint by the UN, at the same time as this president, like other presidents, asserted a right to do it without any constraint of the Constitution. But even Congress said they voted unanimously for this war, misled or not misled. And of course, they can truthfully claim they were misled, whether they believed it or not. They couldn't authorize this war, or make it legal. couldn't make it legal under international law and under the UN Charter. So.
What was the reason for it?
So the reason, well, first of all, there was as much secrecy and lying surrounding this war as around Vietnam. There is a clear analogy. And in the light of that, short of real revelation by highest level people, and we haven't had that yet, no one can say with high confidence what was in the minds of this person or that person. It remains speculative. What we do know is that the reasons they gave us were unfounded and probably in most cases lies. So that doesn't tell us exactly why they did do it. And by the way, that's an analogy with Vietnam too. Let me tell you, a lot of reasons were given for our being in Vietnam. None of them made sense in terms of what was known internally, estimates and projections and whatever. And I'm reminded of a friend of mine from the policy planning staff of the State Department named Bob Johnson, who was one of the few people who had totally opposed the war openly at the time I came into the Pentagon in mid-64. And he had already written a report opposing the idea of bombing North Vietnam, opposing our involvement, and so forth. He was very good on that. He was telling me that he saw Bill Bundy, later Assistant Secretary of State, brother of George Bundy, 20 years later, and on the street, and they were talking about this and that, and Bob said, I said, Bill, why do you think Johnson went into Vietnam in 1965? And Bundy, who had been in charge of this in the State Department and earlier in the Defense Department, said, Bob, I don't know. Now, that seems peculiar from outside because, I've speculated on this and I've written it and so forth. What I'm saying is that when you look at the inside decision-making, now on the tapes, as well as the Pentagon Papers, it gets more and more mysterious how Johnson could have done that in the spring of '65. He was not under the illusion that he would win quickly, cheaply, or ever. We now have tapes of him saying to his mentor, Senator Richard Russell, in the Pentagon, the man who made him majority leader, essentially, his closest confidant. Russell was saying, we aren't going to win, we should get out. We can't succeed anywhere there. And Johnson would say, I know, they're not ever going to give up. He says, we'll give up before they do. This is President Johnson, before he had committed the first 100,000 troops there. He said, if I were them, I wouldn't give up, and they're not going to give up. This is what we read on the tapes, and that leaves us with the question, what the hell was going on here from inside? Well, we have the same problem here. You can give lots of reasons. I'll tell you what my speculation is, that there was a handful of things, different constituencies represented by different people in the administration. The oil men like Cheney and others certainly saw, first there was a number of them, the neocons and others, who see in the absence of the Cold War the ability for the United States to run the world. And if you want to run the world, controlling all the energy of the Middle East and the Caspian and Iran eventually, and Russia eventually, is the way to run the world. You don't want, by the way, that oil to be paid for in euros rather than dollars, and Saddam had specifically just switched to accepting euros for the oil he was selling. You wanted to control the oil, not only of Iraq. Second, bases for that in that huge basin of oil. Third, the concerns of the Likud party of Sharon and Netanyahu, advised by people like Pearl and Wormser, who apparently is helping Fitzgerald at this point to plea bargain. David Wormser, who both wrote advice to Netanyahu back in '96 that they should get rid of Iraq for the purpose of Israel, they should break it down, make it a friendly nation, and so forth. The neocons have had, not all of whom are Jewish at all, have had great influence on that. They're backed by a Christian fundamentalist constituency that believes that the return of the Messiah would be postponed if there is a Palestinian state constricting Israel control in the Middle East. And I believe, by the way, our born-again president should be asked at a press conference by somebody, maybe you would have done it, and I don't know who would do it now, would say, Mr. Bush, President Bush, is it your belief that that a Palestinian state in the West Bank would delay the return of the Messiah? His born-again fundamentalist people do believe that, and my guess is that Bush believes that. Well, I would also like to see him asked, by the way, we're talking about the constituencies here, I would also like to see him asked, is it your belief, Mr. President, that Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and Catholics are doomed to eternal hellfire unless they convert to born-again Christianity. I feel rather sure that he...
I can do that.
What?
I can do that one.
Would you have asked that? I think he would have to answer the yes. I think he would have a lot of trouble with his constituency if he said no, or no comment. But anyway, that's another constituency that's involved. I'll name two others quickly. Rumsfeld, in general, wanting to demonstrate to the army, to our army, that his theories and Andy Marshall's theories, that we could conquer this country in a fast blitzkrieg with no problems, with fewer troops than the Joint Chiefs believe necessary. He wanted to demonstrate that. They wanted to demonstrate general U.S. power and radicalism and so forth, our ability to use that power in the world. So a lot of reasons seemed good enough, none of which they understood would sell with the American people, none of which remotely made the war legal or prudent. And
so they
lied about it. They used the tried and true method.
And they even told the truth. They said that's why we chose weapons.
They're what? I'm sorry.
They even told the truth.
About
Wolfowitz. They said that's we hit on.
Oh yeah. I was thinking, told the truth? What?
Weapons
yeah,
of mass
he did, to Vanity
destruction.
Fair, right. And so you have all these reasons. My concern right now is, I think we have a Democratic Party that would probably not have gone into Iraq, but will not get us out without a change in leadership and a change in positions. We have, and the reasons are obviously different, but which Democrat will be the one to say in getting out, I'll take responsibility for what comes after we get left. I'll give up these bases that Bush has built up so permanently for us in Iraq. I'll give them up. And give them to Iraqis. I'll give the oil of Iraq to the Iraqis, et cetera, et cetera. I don't see it. We need new Democratic leadership, very different from a Hillary Clinton who says we need more troops in Iraq, Joe Biden who says exactly the same, Harry Reid who says the same. Kerry has seen some light in the last week, I take it, due to some pressure. He was saying more troops throughout the campaign. Suddenly he said take 20,000 out by December. I think all of these people have to be told that is not the way to get renominated or to get nominated or to have our support at all. And I thought, shall I quote your suggestion about the DLC, or is that a secret?
Sure.
Is that indiscreet?
Nothing's a secret.
Is that indiscreet? Okay, well, all these people are supported by and represent, starting with Clinton and Gore, the Democratic Leadership Council, whose view has been for over 20 years, Democrats can get elected only by being for more defense spending than the Republicans, by being more aggressive than the Republicans, for being Republican-light. And what I heard from you was a suggestion tonight that I think has a lot of meat in it, and that is to tell the Democratic Leadership Conference, what they call committee, under L. Fromm and some of the others, the Bob Schrums and all these people, join the Republican Party.
Yeah.
Show your true lights here. You cannot give us any reason for being
everybody
Democrats.
who had a different opinion.
I think there's a lot in that. So thank you for the idea, and I think it deserves to be pursued.
Senator, I know you don't like to criticize the United States or even to speculate on, but why do you think we invaded Iraq?
Well, first of all...
and should we pull out?
Yes to the second question. First, I'm proud to say that Canada refused to join the Iraq War. I don't think I want to repeat sort of the rationale that Dan has very effectively put forward. I'd just give you a perspective from outside the United States, from our own country. We think that the United Nations has to be honored not just in the spirit but also in the letter, and that this war was illegal. It did not have a mandate from the Security Council, and that the undermining of international law, which we now see happening, is making the world, not just the Middle East, but the world as a whole, a more dangerous place. And we see the Iraq war, well, first of all, it appears to us that the government of the United States is using the tragedy of 9/11 as a cover for moves both domestically in its civil rights, which is not our concern, but we observe this, and internationally in its refusal to join what I would call the momentum of our times for the International Criminal Court, the various moves that have been made internationally, and to build a more secure kind of world in a cooperative manner rather than an overarching dominant position that the United States represents. And we see this particularly coming to the fore now in space weapons. And I hope we might get a chance to talk about that for a moment. But on the central theme of the evening, nuclear weapons, the role of the United States in going into Iraq in the way that it has done this, has undermined not only international law, but its own credibility in speaking to the rest of the world. And so for us, Iraq has implications that go far beyond the actual war itself, serious and tragic as that war is. And that's why we think that, certainly there's a dominant thought in Canada, that this has got to be ended sooner rather than later. And I know that it may not be too popular in some circles in the United States to talk about withdrawing the United States troops, but until the U.S. shows that it is not going to be a perpetual occupier, even over the next decade or so, I think that the reaction that we're now seeing and the deaths are going to mount, and we're very concerned about this.
So you really think that the wiping out of all collective security and the dominance, unilateral dominance, was what we were really seeking?
Well, you see, the Pentagon has put out this vision called Vision 2020 for that is what's called full spectrum dominance, that they want to dominate in land, sea, air, and space. And this really deeply concerns us. And when the United States asked Canada to join in the ballistic missile defense system, that's a whole subject that maybe ought to be discussed. But when the U.S. asked Canada, we thought about it for quite a while and finally said no, that we would not join the ballistic missile defense system because we see it as a direct move to weapons in space. And it is a strong policy of the government of Canada to prevent the weaponization of space. And we see the ballistic missile defense system as the first step in that. So I'm not one of those who says that, everything gets all tied together into a simple theme. The world is a very complex place. But you've asked about Iraq, and we see Iraq in larger terms than just Iraq itself. We see it in terms that the Pentagon has itself put out of dominance of the world.
Right. I would like to ask both of you, is there a valid fear that terrorists, nihilists, will get their hands on nuclear weapons? You think you sort of alluded. What can be done to revive this world disarmament?
Well, I'll start on that one. No less a figure than the Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, has 3 times in the past 6 months publicly warned that a major catastrophe is waiting to happen as a result of a terrorist use of a nuclear device. One doesn't want to go and become an alarmist and, rev people up, and I don't like to do it myself. And I'm very careful in my own book to present a sort of a balanced approach. But the experts on this very subject of terrorism and nuclear, the possibility of a nuclear attack, the experts are coming to the view that it is unlikely that the world will be spared a detonation of some kind. Maybe it'll be what's called a clean bomb or something. It's an oxymoron. Even to talk this way when the result is going to be the deaths of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And so it is this very possibility that is a real possibility that ought to animate us to close all the loopholes. For example, in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, to ensure that countries do not use their access to nuclear energy to convert that to nuclear weapons, and also to tighten up all the ways in which terrorists can get access through theft or smuggling or what have you, get access to nuclear materials. But even that won't be enough until we get to a point where we put ironclad international mandated rules in place to control nuclear materials and to eliminate nuclear weapons. Nobody here is naive enough to think that nuclear weapons can be eliminated overnight. They cannot be. But until we show that we are united in our desire and our commitment to start down that avenue together, to close all the loopholes, to close the ways in which countries, states, and terrorists can get access to nuclear weapons, we are going to live in a very dangerous place. It defies credibility to suggest that we can go on with the status quo. The status quo is that we have nuclear weapons and they're not being used. As long as any one country maintains nuclear weapons, other countries are going to want to get them. They have become the currency of power. And as I said in my opening comment, whereas they were used for deterrence in the Cold War, now they've been put into warfighting strategies. And it's not just the United States. Russia is doing the same thing. But it's because the United States is such a leader. It's such a powerful. The United States is spending half of all the world military expenditures. $1 trillion the world is spending on arms. The United States spends half. I don't think, Helen, I bet you that, somebody ought to do a survey. I don't think that the American people understand that their government is spending $110 million every day on nuclear weapons alone. When I used to say this in my class that I taught at the University of Alberta, they'd say, well, professor, you've made a mistake. You mean the United States is spending $110 million a year on nuclear. I said they're spending $110 million a day on nuclear weapons. And I think that some facts like that have got to be drilled into the system here so that we can help them to elevate the goals and aspirations of this great country to lead the way forward toward the elimination of nuclear weapons, not stand and blocking the path of those who want to move.
Dr. Ellsberg, what is your view on the possibility of terrorists taking over?
I think the terrorist threat is very serious, even without nuclear weapons. And on the question of nuclear weapons, given the recruitment that we are giving day by day with our occupation of Iraq and other policies to Al-Qaeda, in the most broad sense, the network of people who are ready to die in order to kill Americans. I think there are more of them every day that we follow our present policies. In that world, I can't convince myself that there's much I can't see how it is not possible for them to get nuclear materials. With thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of nuclear weapons and materials, tons and tons of materials, poorly guarded in Russia. That would be, I'd put that at the top of the list there as the nuclear black market. I don't see how I can't convince myself that it's impossible or even hard for them to get a nuclear weapon eventually, and not necessarily just nuclear materials. I can't see why they can't buy a weapon system. Finished weapon, and other countries can do it too, but nuclear groups. One could say that if you can't for any amount of money, and we're millions, hundreds of millions, 10 millions, they can get that. If you can't get a nuclear weapon out of Russia for that, then the theory of markets can be discarded altogether. This has no price, apparently.
So what can we do about it?
So, you know, after 60 years of spreading nuclear reactors around the world, or one could say 50 years, I guess now, since the mid-50s. 50 years of that, there's plutonium all around the world, starting with Atoms for Peace. And with the availability of that now in 30 to 40 countries, I don't think there's any way of reducing the chance of a terrorist bomb close to zero. You can't even make it small, in my opinion. However, you do not have to be increasing the likelihood of that day by day. And all the measures that Doug spoke of, I'd sum them up in one respect by that the way to deal with this is the same way to deal with terrorism in general, and that is by multilateral approach, virtually approaching global cooperation. It can't be dealt with at all unilaterally. Our unilateral measures are exacerbating the problem. And that means multilateral, not just with our friends. It means everybody has to be able to cooperate on this, including the many police regimes and authoritarian regimes that are part of the UN. We need help from their police forces, too. We need help and cooperation from their armies and their intelligence services. We can't do without it. And we cannot get that, as Doug put it, with this two-tier system, or let's say a three-tier system, the two superpowers and then half a dozen middle nuclear powers, let's say, and maybe some little ones, but that's all. You don't need any, we need thousands forever. That doesn't get you access to anybody's country for inspection. We need the kind of inspection that under extraordinary circumstances we got in Iraq. That's what we need, generally. And we got that, of course, by winning a war. We can't do that generally. We notice that that is one example of success. Contrary to our administration, who said, it's been a failure, let's stop it, that goes nowhere, we now know that, in fact, it actually worked. Saddam is just about as bad as Bush ever said he was, and he prudently decided that the inspectors were too likely to find those things if he continued them at all, and that we were too likely to react. So he gave up his program. That was Saddam. We need that all over the place, and we cannot get it while we say we are exempt from inspection. Any country that joins the club, Israel, India, North Korea, is also exempt from inspection from then on. That can't work. So we're left with a world in which terrorists should be able to get nuclear material from, if not from Russia, from Pakistan, from North Korea.
Well, do we have any moral right to dictate to other nations when we're building a whole new generation?
Well, no, that's what I'm saying. I didn't spell that out. To get to, you have to eliminate that two-tier approach. As I often say in the household, being 74 now, I've learned that double standards are all the standards that exist. There is nothing else. If you do away with double standards, you don't have any standards. But there are extremes on this, and we cannot, as you say, keep saying, we have a right to develop new weapons, we have a right to get ready for testing new weapons, we have a right to threaten them, as we're doing right now. You don't have the right to have any. That gets us nowhere. So we have to reverse those policies.
What gives us that right?
Well, no. Well, might.
What else? As that?
You know, that's the way of the world. That's their theory. The trouble is that in a nuclear era, might doesn't translate, as you know, into omnipotence. Even our non-nuclear might, which is unparalleled thanks to this enormous spending that we do, has not given us the ability and never will to eliminate resistance in Iraq any more than we could eliminate resistance in Vietnam. And the same with nuclear policies. The idea that each president has gone along with, some more enthusiastically than others, has really been, we are willing to accept other countries, starting with Russia, building up their weapons as long as we have more and ours are better. And we accept the inevitable consequence of that other people will join the club. But as long as they are junior members and we are invulnerable, we are superior, we're safe.
So we have
that's
to keep
never been
building.
that's
Then we
never
have
been
to keep
reliable,
building.
and now that it's going to get in the hands of people who genuinely can't be deterred, unlike Saddam, it's as foolish as the belief that we would have no resistance in Vietnam or in Iraq.
What do you think, Senator?
Yeah, Helen, a moment ago you introduced the idea of we don't have a moral right, the whole question of morality. I'd like to pick up on that for a moment. I think it's very important to think about this for a couple of minutes. What right do we have to threaten to use weapons of such a massive destruction against people whom we don't know, with whom we have no quarrel, who have every bit as much to live as we do, who have the same human rights as we do, if human rights are universal and inherent? Don't we have to stop and think about this? And so for me, this whole question of nuclear weapons, which the technicians would have you believe is much too complex for you to understand. They got away with this for a long time. And need to be told that nuclear weapons represent moral bankruptcy. There is not a shred of morality in nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are furthermore illegal. Their use in any circumstances whatsoever would contravene every aspect of humanitarian law. In addition to the immorality and illegality of nuclear weapons, there's now a third element that is now coming to the fore. David, next year you should bring here to this podium, if you can find such a person, somebody who will come up here and look this audience right in the eye and give the reasons intellectually for the possession and use of nuclear weapons. And David, you will look a long time before you can find such an individual, because there is no intellectual basis for the possession and use of nuclear weapons, unless of course you restore everything to power and the drive for power. But if we can tell the people, not just the American people, but people around the world and people in my own country too, that nuclear weapons are immoral, they're illegal, and they do not have any intellectual standing, then I think that's an argument that is understandable and that people can start to pick up on to press the policymakers, the politicians who have been for too long been intimidated, manipulated by the nuclear proponents, the nuclear planners. It's time for the people of the world, people like we're sitting right in this room tonight, to stand up and say to every policymaker, you come with me to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I just was there for the 60th anniversary. And look what happened in those two cities. Do you want that to happen again? There is no morality, no legality, and no intellectual standing. That's what I think the people of the world have a right to express their views and have them heard by the policymakers.
Thank you. Dr. Ellsberg, is the world moving more toward a nuclear war? Is it inevitable? And what can be done to save mankind?
I don't think almost anything is inevitable, or at least we're not able to say with any reliability or confidence what is inevitable in the world. And I don't think it is inevitable in case. On the other hand, it's getting increasingly hard to point to what is going to avert indefinitely or for decades a nuclear war or the use of terrorist weapons. On the inevitability side, there have been times, as my wife knows, in the last 30 years when I was equally worried about nuclear war, and as I am now, and worried about a much larger scale war.
Why aren't more people worried?
What?
Why aren't more people worried?
Yeah, well, no, I'm saying when I was very worried about this, as I am now, it didn't happen. What I was worried about was a US-Soviet exchange, the likelihood of which, in retrospect, I think was quite serious had the world not changed. But the end of the Cold War, and I knew no one who foresaw that, changed the world. It was a change in consciousness and a change in conditions, and just the world changed remarkably, and the chance of a nuclear war between the US and Soviet Union has not gone to zero at all. That's outrageous and unforgivable and inexcusable that we maintain these weapons on alert, subject to a possible accidental launch or an escalation.
5,000
What?
5,000 on alert.
Exactly. That's absolutely inexcusable, but I would say the risk of that, which is not zero, is much, much lower than it was 30 years ago. To take another example, I don't know who foresaw the change from apartheid to a majority government in South Africa happening without large-scale violence. Nobody saw that. So you could call that a miracle, but it was the kind of miracle that happens with a lot of participation of a lot of people. I do say, I think it will take something as unforeseeable and as dramatic in a change in world consciousness for that to happen. By the way, not in the change of everybody's consciousness. The world is filled with people, as Douglas was saying, not only populations, but many governments who see the problem, whose consciousness does not have to change. But if we're talking about the leaders of nuclear states, even the new ones, India, Pakistan, somewhat older, Israel, all of which now have nuclear policies with great support of their population, that has to change very dramatically. And on the one hand, as I'm saying, from the examples I'm saying, that doesn't define it as impossible, but it does mean that it takes more effort and more creativity and more luck, if you like, more grace, than we have seen. I will say, for all the efforts of the middle power initiatives, Doug, and everything else, which are sterling, they're marvelous, in showing that there is an alternative, that the crucial myth, there is no alternative to what we're doing, is untrue. And they can show how you could denuclearize, how you could lower the risk. If you wanted a program, either of us could give you a program, maybe you want that, but we could give 9 steps or 11 steps or 17 steps, and we would agree. I would bet we would agree totally on that program with a lot of other people. But what has to change is the desire and will of leaderships and elites in the nuclear weapons states to adopt such a program, and that we're not nearly at yet. And there are some countries who would go along with it pretty quickly if the US led the way. But with the US not leading the way, I don't know of a country that can be said to have done everything it could, diplomatically, economically, to alert the world to this problem. I don't think any country that I can speak of in the world, and some of them have advanced very good programs. Australia, each of the middle power initiatives have put out programs. But when it comes to taking measures to get to pressure and to change the views of the US and now the Soviet Union, or Putin rather, Russia, who is moving in the nuclear direction, as you say, I haven't seen the pressure, and we need that urgently. I don't know if we disagree on that or not, Doug.
I think on an evening like this, we want to feel some empowerment that our work can be productive, and I do feel that. To your question, Helen, do I think that nuclear war is inevitable? If I thought so, I don't think I would come here tonight. I think that what we ought to sort of bring back into a focused discussion the momentum that is actually happening now with respect to closing the net on nuclear weapons. Sometimes the analysis that we give of the extent of the problem sort of sweeps aside what is actually being done. In 1995, the Non-Proliferation Treaty was indefinitely extended. That made permanent the legal obligation of the nuclear weapon states to negotiate their elimination. And in 1996, the International Court of Justice upheld that and said that the states have an obligation to conclude negotiations, not just pursue them, but to conclude negotiations for the elimination. And in 2000, when the Non-Proliferation Treaty was reviewed that year, all states, including the United States, signed on to what was called an unequivocal undertaking to the total elimination of nuclear weapons via a program of 13 practical steps. It's true that in 2002, the United States changed its position, but the historical momentum that is occurring now is still going on. And reference has been made here earlier tonight to other states that do care quite deeply about this. And I mentioned in my opening comment 28 states that joined us on October the 3rd at the United States in a new effort to build the legal, political, and technical elements for a nuclear weapons-free world. Civil society, there's a lot of civil society action here. It may be true that the issue is not a dominant one in the political agenda, in the media attention. I grant you all that. But I think that there is an opportunity that many groups within the civil society groupings have taken to try to put forward into the political elements, the political systems, practical plans for moving forward. And I would say, the reference was made here, Dan made it earlier tonight, about the United States might be getting ready to test a nuclear weapon. If there's one thing that really we ought to concentrate on, it's to try to get the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty ratified. There are 11 holdout states. There's 44 states that have to ratify it before it becomes into force, and there's still 11 that have not done so. 10 of them are going to be easily handled. It's the United States is the only country that has deliberately rejected the treaty. First of all, when it was denied the Senate ratification in 1999, then when the Bush administration came to power, they rejected the treaty as a whole. So I think that if there's anything that we really ought to concentrate on, it's to stop any future testing. And I think that the American people would be solidly behind, it seems to me, a worldwide movement that I sense gathering some steam to block any future testing of nuclear weapons.
Could I comment on that? Just to make it interesting, let me comment on your comment here. First of all, to the extent that there is a momentum in the world, and there is, a creative kind, toward the necessity for changing the policies of the of the superpowers, especially the U.S. I know of no individual in the world who deserves more credit for that than you. And that does exist. And I know of no official or diplomat in the world that I respect more than you, or whose efforts I think deserves more credit. And it has had effect outside the U.S. But now, not just because I'm an American citizen, but I think the situation actually is this. One cannot, I'm sure you didn't mean to say, but I have to oppose any implication to say that there has been a favorable momentum, a positive direction in the policies of the one country of supreme importance on this issue, which is the U.S. Not only the U.S. We're not. Russia is also very important. You can mention a lot of other countries, including India and Pakistan, a number of others. But nothing can be done significantly here without a vast change in the policy of the U.S. And what has to be seen is that has gone in the wrong direction. The momentum is in the other direction.
You see, Dan, there is a difference coming to the fore here now. It's interesting. You're American-centric in your view here, and I'm trying to give it sort of a world-centric view here. There is a lot of momentum in other countries, and you're quite right that you'd be hard pressed to find any momentum inside the United States. It's quite the reverse. But just because I take the view, as the chairman of an international organization, the Middle Powers Initiative, that just because we're roadblocked in one country, which is of supreme importance to be sure, doesn't mean that we're going to be roadblocked in other areas of the world that really want to move forward. And I think that as we try to do that, maybe we make a contribution to unblocking in the United States.
Well, let me pick up on that. That's very good. Really, I think that to the extent that other countries begin to act together to ask creatively how they can pursue these goals without the help of the United States. Certainly, they have to aim at changing U.S. policy, but whether they can do that is in question. There's certainly a lot of things they can do without the U.S., that's true. And that's all to the good. But I'll mention one thing that follows directly on your earlier comment. There's a lot of people in this country, and maybe some in this room, who don't see much difference between the Democrats and Republicans in general. I don't know how many people there are like that, but that can be very misleading. And you pointed toward one that probably not everybody in this audience quite recognizes the implication. You mentioned that following the 1995 review conference of the NPT, and these go every 5 years, and from now on, supposedly because of the indefinite duration of the thing, there was a 2000 conference which spelled out the obligations of the U.S. And the U.S. delegation to that committed the U.S., if I'm not mistaken, to this general proposal of the various moves that were going to be taken to do this. In the year 2000, the U.S. backed away. Now, what had happened? Had the world changed? No, the administration had changed. 2000 was the last year of Clinton. And the point is that this administration not only doesn't feel bound by those, they oppose every one of those measures. They oppose it and mean to violate it if possible. So we get to the year, this year, then as you know, better than I, you were probably involved in it, were you not? In 2005, with the next meeting, 5-year meeting, our new representative to this, Bolton, was, or at least in his role, I guess, still in the State Department, was fighting behind the scenes to remove from the preamble, I think, to their work, the agenda of their work, any reference to the previous 5 years' commitment. Every reference which was in there, the UN, the NPT powers have all, including the U.S., committed themselves to the following measures, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Bolton's attitude, of course representing Bush, was we don't want any mention of those commitments, not even to say we don't agree with them or we want to renegotiate them. He didn't want it mentioned that those had ever occurred. Now, he was opposed on that issue. He got some resistance on it.
Absolutely.
Definitely. But that didn't change. Do you think that changed the attitude of the Bush administration? I'm sure you don't, really. Whatever they said in lip service, they do not subscribe to the commitments that were made by the Clinton administration. And I think that has to say that from the U.S. point of view, those commitments are just void at this point.
I take the view that the Bush administration that is recalcitrant won't be around forever. There is a review, the next review of the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 2010, and you know what will happen between now and then. That's for the American people to decide. But I have to keep coming back to my role as the chairman of an international body. Of course, I'm concerned about the United States. I mean, I made that clear earlier tonight. But I cannot be paralyzed. Just because there is a certain ideology that is driving this administration, I have to be as creative as I can be in helping other governments through the organization that we represent here to find ways to prepare the political, legal, and technical elements for a nuclear weapons-free world. And we think this is a constructive thing to do. And that if by taking this sort of what I call a creative approach, plugging into the desire of many states. I mentioned that there were 28 that came to the meeting that we held, but that was by invitation. If we had opened it up, we would have had many, many more. These are important states that we're working with, and we have to do it in a manageable manner. And we're going on to a second meeting in Europe in early March, a 4-day meeting where we're bringing in experts. We're going to a third meeting that's going to be hosted by one of the governments concerned. And so I think that we should take note of the fact that the rest of the world, while it's certainly concerned about the United States, is not going to stand still while this roadblock is there.
Before we wind up, I have two quick questions. One, do you think Star Wars would work? And what do you think of depleted uranium, the use of depleted, which the Pentagon poo-poos as being dangerous for you, each of you?
Yeah, well, I think Star Wars would first of all, I'm not a scientist, but all my reading indicates to me that the chances of it working are so remote as to not to justify the expense involved. Moreover, it signifies sort of this shooting gallery in the heavens idea of dominance, and I think it should be opposed. It appears to us in Canada now that the technical side of the ballistic missile defense system is failing, and thus the political drive for it seems to be dropping. Right. And as far as I'm concerned, that's a good thing.
How about depleted uranium?
Well, I don't think that we ought to do everything we can to get rid of depleted uranium. I mean, it's certainly an immoral use of weaponry, and so anyway, I'll leave it at that.
How can the Pentagon keep saying that it's not dangerous?
I don't know. I'll agree with him on this. How can they? I can't judge technically on the question. I have seen videos and reports and whatnot that indicate that it deserves the utmost intense investigation of its health effects. The UN is doing that, if I'm not mistaken, but where are they coming out on that? I don't know. So I would say it's an extremely worrisome problem. Could it be that they are simply underestimating the effects on their own soldiers? Could they possibly do that? Well, that's what they did with Agent Orange.
For 400 billion years.
No, that's what they did with Agent Orange. That's what they did with the radioactive tests, the nuclear tests and the radioactive effects on our soldiers in Nevada. And I have to say that as somebody who is pretty skeptical, let's say, or I'm not entirely naive about the Pentagon somehow, I continue to be startled and shocked as a former Marine at the willingness of the Pentagon to ignore and deprecate and do nothing about health problems for our own veterans. It's absolutely shocking and to me baffling. I can't conceive of it. And I've learned that what we do to other people, as with Agent Orange, it's horrible to say, but it doesn't cause them a lot of problem. But I would have thought that what they're doing to our own soldiers, the Gulf War syndrome, which it took so long for them to admit that it even existed, who knows what is happening to our soldiers in Iraq right now, surrounded by the depleted uranium. And I know one thing for sure, the Pentagon is not intensely interested in finding out, and that's terrible.
And how about the arming of the heavens?
I'm glad you reminded me of that, because
me?
I don't usually have my attention on that so much. And I absolutely agree. The weaponizing of space is a great problem. And of course, another thing they want to do is to be able to clear the skies of everybody else's communication satellites and intelligence satellites very fast, which will not make wars easier to end or safer on the whole, or the control of, it's like eliminating the control system for the Russian missiles, which is already in a deteriorating stage. And yet we are absolutely unwilling to move to a non-alert system and get the Russians off non-alert. We'd rather have our weapons on alert at the cost of having their weapons on alert. And that means that if this status quo doesn't change, let's put it this way, take the momentum at its absolute best in the world, and there is positive things outside this country especially. Take it at its best estimate. If I said the momentum stays at that level in the direction of reducing nuclear weapons, then in answer to your earlier question, yes, nuclear war is inevitable, and also big nuclear war is inevitable. That is outrageous, intolerable, and it takes a lot more focus in the world and effort and sacrifice to change it than we're seeing.
Doing nothing.
Yeah.
Well, my last question is, because I cover the most secretive administration, I think, of modern times. I'd like to ask Dr. Ellsberg, your revelation of the Pentagon Papers, I'm sure, was at a great cost to you. Why are whistleblowers so unsung and treated so badly?
Why are, say again, whistleblowers?
Treated so badly.
Well, there are two sides to that. If they hadn't gotten so panicked by me, as to commit crimes to shut me up, then Nixon would have stayed in office and the war would have gone on longer. And if Joe Wilson had not actually panicked them so much in terms of his undermining their credibility, they wouldn't have committed crimes that is about to put Libya in jail.
Why were you a pariah, and why is Wilson, in fact, being shoved in a corner?
Well, you have very general point there. It does, for people to do what I believe they should do, which is to put out the truth in the form of documents, because it takes documents to demonstrate to the public, to make them believe that their president is actually lying to them and not merely mistaken, or that he has the kinds of ambitions that you were describing earlier, the project for a new American century, which I think is still in progress, which aims at Syria and Iran and even Saudi Arabia, in addition to Iraq. Those are, the fact that some out-of-office people had that idea is on the web. You can find the Project for New American Century on the web, PNAC. But the fact that those people now in office are pursuing those aims remains a secret. They lie about it, they deny it. To get that really out, you need to have top secret documents inside the government, like the British Downing Street memos, which came out in England showing that the British understood that we were being lied into this war.
The American newspapers didn't cover it for 3 weeks.
Can you tell me why that was? You tell me. I'm really asking. I don't know.
Because they wanted to go to war.
Well, no, this was just this last year. So why did they, for 3 weeks, ignore that? I don't know the answer to that. Do you?
They claimed that they were too busy and so forth, but nothing stacks up.
the equivalent.
Can I have the floor in just a second?
Okay, I'm going to take
Sure.
last 60 seconds here. The
Sure.
equivalent memos to the Downing Street memos exist in this country because they were British minutes of American meetings. There are American top secret minutes of those same meetings. They have not been released. And what I've been saying to people who have those minutes right now in their safes, I do say to them, don't do what I did. Don't wait till the war has started. Don't wait till we've attacked Iran. Don't wait till we've attacked Syria. Put out those documents that show illegal plans, illegal wars, and lying to the public now, at whatever cost to yourself. Give it. Don't give it just to Congress. Don't give it just to Congress first, as I did, and I wasted 22 months on that. Don't give it just to the Democrats. They don't appear willing to do much with it. Give it to the press and the Congress at the same time, at whatever cost. You can save a war's worth of lives.
Try to get them to print it.
And get them to print it. Put it on the internet if possible.
I want to thank you. I want to thank you all for a great discussion. Can I, Doug and Dan and Helen, can I ask you to conclude the evening with one sentence each, just one sentence, on what gives you hope?
Life. Life.
Hope
While there's
future
life,
hope.
there's hope. And as we've seen, we have seen essential miracles. I named two of them in the past. We need something not less than that, but not greater than that in the way of a consciousness change.
Doug?
I learned about hope going to Hiroshima, as I've been there several times. When I see the people there reaching out in a spirit of reconciliation and a healing, for me, that is a source of hope we can have in the world today.
Thank you. And Helen, do you have a comment on hope?
There's no alternative.
Good.